What do you picture when you think of storytelling? If you're in a safe place to do it, close your eyes and picture it. If you're driving or otherwise unable to close your eyes safely, just think about it. What do you think of? What images come to mind? Do you see a group of friends around a campfire, telling stories late into the night as the fire crackles and the smoke dances? Do you picture a face illuminated solely by a flashlight, telling scary stories to spook their friends? Maybe you picture a parent sitting next to a child tucked into bed, reading a beloved bedtime story for the 100th time. You may even see a group huddled around a table, rolling dice as they venture through the forgotten realms. Or maybe you picture storytelling more abstractly, in a different medium. Something like painting, or drawing, or sewing. Maybe you see a musician, or a composer. Maybe you picture a photographer, telling a story in a single frame. Or a director or cinematographer, telling a story in a whole lot of frames. However you picture it, storytelling is undeniably human. Having a story and wanting to share it is something fundamental, something universal. From the richest royal to the poorest peasant, we all want to share and be understood. But some people simply have a gift for it. The two best storytellers I've ever met are my father and my maternal grandfather. My father worked as an appliance repairman for decades before moving into being a gas repairman. He works with his hands and can fix just about anything you give him. I've seen him diagnose the issues on a washer and dryer over the phone. He literally just has the person hold the phone up to the dryer and he'll tell you, oh, it's the Sneezler valve, or some other nonsense I've never heard of. And every time, he's right. Because of this, I've always rejected the traditional explanation of intelligence being based on things like grades or reasoning ability or logic. Because my dad will happily tell you about the time one of his high school teachers walked up to him and said, "Merry Christmas, I'm going to pass you so you can graduate," despite him having clearly not passed the class. My dad is very smart, but every societal measure of intelligence would tell you the opposite. Despite his incredible gifts in repair, his true gift is in his storytelling. He'll sit down and tell you about some random encounter with a customer from his day, and by the end of it, you'll be laughing so hard there's tears coming from your eyes. 10 minutes later, he'll tell you some part of it again, and you'll be cry laughing all over again. My maternal grandfather fit a similar vein. He worked blue-collar jobs his whole life. After he left the Marines, he worked as a truck driver, a car repairman, he helped out on a farm, things like that. And every Sunday, when my grandmother would invite over people from church to eat the mountain of food she had cooked, the real appeal was always the stories my grandfather would tell. At the end of the meal, he would lean back in his chair, put butter on a slice of white bread, and launch into some story from his life. He'd tell stories about how he pranked an old man with a hearing aid by slowly turning down the radio quieter and quieter until the man got so fed up he ripped the thing out of his ear with a curse. Or he'd tell you about the time an old lady brought her sports car into the shop. The woman had never driven it above 20 miles an hour, and my grandfather would tell you all about how he fixed it simply by flooring it as he took it around the block. Or he'd tell you about the time he was a kid and knew about some local girls who skinny dipped in a nearby pond. So, he got some fireworks and went down to the pond and lit them up, hoping it would scare them and he would get to see some naked girls. Except, he didn't get rid of the firework in time, and it blew off his finger. "This finger," he'd always end with as he flipped you off with his stub of a middle finger. My mother, to this day, swears that's not what he told her. He told her he lost it in some kind of machining accident. That's the other thing about my grandfather. He played a little fast and loose with the truth, which only made his stories all the more enthralling for a younger me. Of course, when the two of them were together, their stories only became all the more insane. My favorite stories, in fact, were always of the time the two spent together. Now, I can't do them justice, but I'll simply tease you by saying that my father, to this day, absolutely refuses to enter a Victoria's Secret because of the trauma my grandfather inflicted on him on that fateful day. Because of these two goofballs, I've always had a deep appreciation and love for the art of oral storytelling. It's the kind of thing that you can picture at the beginning of humanity, and the kind of thing you can see being there at the end. Beyond our basic bodily functions like breathing and eating, what else can you say that about? What else could survive all ages of progress and change and technology but our basest desire to share our stories? So today, I want to talk about oral storytelling. Just to be clear, I'm not going to be covering a singular author this episode. Instead, I want to look at 3 key storytellers from Greece, England, and China. While the more natural places to look for a strong tradition of oral history and storytelling might be the Native Americans or the tribes of Africa, I've chosen these 3 places because I want to focus on 3 specific examples of times that oral storytelling became written storytelling. If my choice of location and storytellers disappoints you, don't fret. I love this topic, and we may return to it in the future. Today, in our modern world, there are stories that are written to be read aloud. Things like children's stories, or spoken word poetry, or podcast scripts. But that's not what I want to talk about today. Today, I'm talking about stories that began as purely verbal stories and were later written down. Due to the age of the stories we'll be talking about, we can't be 100% sure that these stories were created while speaking them aloud, but there's compelling evidence. Our first trip is to the 8th century BC. Maybe. It was a pretty solid century. Some of the first documented solar eclipses occur in this century. King Ping of China moved the capital of the Eastern Zhou dynasty to modern-day Luoyang, becoming the first person to make Luoyang a capital city. Some of the earliest Upanishads are potentially being written, forming the foundation for Hinduism. On the Italian peninsula, Romulus may have killed his brother Remus and founded the Kingdom of Rome. That probably won't amount to much, though. Now, all of these events are notable, but they're not where our attention is focused. Our attention is on a man. Some accounts remark that he is a blind man from modern-day Turkey who lives on the island of Chios. Some say he's not blind at all. Some say he's the son of the river Meles and the nymph Chrythais. Some say he's the son of Telemachus and Epicasta, making him the grandson of King Nestor and Odysseus. Many today even believe he's not one man, but 2, and ranges for his exact birth date span over 5 centuries. He's truly a man, or men, of mystery. Let's talk about Homer. Now, normally for this show, when I say, let's talk about an author, we discuss their life. This isn't really possible with Homer. We have absolutely no certifiable evidence about the life of Homer. No certifiable birth or death century, let alone date. I pretty arbitrarily picked the 8th century, which is one of the more common suggestions, but it could easily be earlier or later. Homer has no confirmed parentage, especially since one of the main pair of parents he's commonly attributed to is literally a nymph in a river. You'd think that maybe modern literary study would reveal some details about the author, right? Wrong. The only thing modern literary examinations can agree on is that the two works conclusively attributed to Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad, are written by two different people. The one through line in depictions of Homer is his blindness, and even that is doubted. It's possible he was portrayed as blind, not because of an actual lack of sight, but because his stories came from and were passed on by verbal storytelling, so he was portrayed as blind to emphasize his mouth. Regardless of who the man or men was or were, scholars are pretty certain that the original creators of the Iliad and the Odyssey created them verbally. The creator, who I'm just gonna call Homer, was likely an aoidos, which literally translates as singer. Now, when our modern ears hear singer, we think music. And while there certainly may have been musical elements, it's also possible that an aoidos may have performed more like a spoken word poet. Centuries after being written down, the Greeks would still perform epic works orally. Those that specialized in epic poems like Homer's were called rhapsodes or rhapsodists, which translates roughly to someone who sews songs together. Because while performing the same basic story every time, rhapsodists were encouraged to add songs, jokes, and improv to fit the audience's mood. And I think that's a nice callback to the way these works were originally conceived. It's believed that, while Homer is the one to put the stories together, he likely pulled from existing songs and stories that were already out there to make one big work. Later performers being able to alter and add to the big story by adding in their own little ones is, in my opinion, a nice touch. That being said, there's also some thought that rhapsodists worked from the exact written works and were not actually allowed to make any real changes. And with that, we're going to leave Homer behind. His compositions helped build the foundations for European literature and are still given to students today to read and study. But there's too little known about him and his time. I've had to use the words probably and maybe a whole lot, and I'm sick of it. So we're going to go ahead and jump ahead more than 1,000 years. Surely, with that big of a jump, we'll get some more reliable information. I mean, we're in the AD times now, somewhere between 800 and 1000 AD. Practically modern times. That Roman kingdom Romulus founded, it's pretty much come and gone. It split in half around 400 AD, and while the western half would collapse about a century after that, the eastern half was flourishing at this point. Now known as the Byzantine Empire, this time frame was really the peak of their power and influence. The West, however, was feeling lonely without a Roman Empire, so they brought it back around the year 800 and crowned Charlemagne the emperor of the new Holy Roman Empire. In the far distant future of the 1700s, Voltaire will say, "This agglomeration, which was called and which still calls itself the Holy Roman Empire, was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire." Now I know that's a popular quote, but I wouldn't use that single quote to be your sole source on the subject. It had its moments of holiness and empireness throughout the years, although admittedly, while it would at some points contain Rome, its Romanness was never really that high. It was more Germanic than anything. What's all this got to do with our storytelling discussion? Absolutely nothing. But I mentioned Romulus during Homer's intro, so I thought I'd give you a little follow-up. If you set something up in a story, you gotta follow up on it. Chekhov from Star Trek taught me that. Instead of the Byzantine Empire or the Holy Roman Empire, we're going to focus on a place a little further north. We'll call it England. This England is a little different than the England you may be familiar with. This is pre-Norman invasion. It's rough and Nordic, having been settled by a mix of Scandinavian Vikings and Anglo-Saxon Germans. The country is largely Christian at this point, but that's a recent change. The pagan roots of the Vikings and the Germans are still prevalent and powerful. And they do speak English, but it's not an English you or I would probably understand. Modern English is sometimes described as a bunch of languages standing on each other's shoulders in a trench coat. This English, called Old English, is probably not the language at the very bottom, as that's probably a truly Germanic language, but it's pretty far down there. When William the Conqueror shows up in 1066, he'll introduce the English nobles to French, which will eventually merge with the commoners' Old English and create Middle English, which is a little bit closer to our modern English. Around this time, which I'll remind you is around the year 1000, a poem is written down. Its author is simply known as the Beowulf Poet, and the poem, believe it or not, is Beowulf. What a weird coincidence that the Beowulf Poet happened to write Beowulf. Well, the poet kinda wrote Beowulf. He definitely wrote down the poem we call Beowulf, but he wrote the poem with no title. We get the title Beowulf from the main character. This poem lives in a codex, which is kind of an early form of a book commonly called the Noel Codex, due to it being owned, at one point, by Lawrence Noel, a 16th century scholar who focused on Old English and wrote his name on the front. It was later passed into the hands of Sir Robert Cotton. Robert Cotton is most famous for the Cotton Library, a collection of medieval manuscripts that he went around and preserved. You see, Henry VIII had created the Church of England after he split England away from papal control after the Pope wouldn't let him divorce his wife. So a lot of the old monasteries were shut down, and the medieval manuscripts they had been preserving were all of a sudden out in the world and available for acquisition. Robert Cotton was one of the few people to understand the true cultural significance of these manuscripts, and he collected them into a large collection that contained the only surviving copies of stories like Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. A library containing an incredible collection of ancient texts. Where have I heard this story before? Oh, that's right, the Library of Alexandria. How was that destroyed? It was burned in a fire caused by Julius Caesar. I knew there was a reason we were talking about the Romans. The Cotton Library, meanwhile, also liked to talk about Romans. In fact, the sections of the library were categorized by what bust was sitting on that shelf. Most of the shelves had prominent Romans like Augustus, Nero, and Vespasian. A bust of Julius Caesar also sat on one of the shelves. Caesar? A library? You probably see where this is going. In 1731, the Cotton Library caught fire, and a number of manuscripts were heavily damaged, and some were destroyed completely. The Noel Codex was burned and damaged, but Beowulf survived, though it was now a little singed around the edges. Now, you may have noticed that I've been focusing on the story of the manuscript and not the story itself. That's because the manuscript has a much clearer history than the story itself. The story was written down in roughly 1000 AD. That's pretty much accepted. What isn't accepted is when the story was composed. You see, the story originated not as paper and ink, but in words and sounds from a storyteller. J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the most prominent scholars of Beowulf, places the originating date in the 8th century. He argues that, At the very least, it was within a generation or two of the Christianization of England due to its accurate portrayal of paganism. Now, you may be thinking that Tolkien gets to be a prominent scholar of Beowulf just because of his later fame from Lord of the Rings, but you couldn't be more wrong. Tolkien was a nut about languages, especially Old English, and basically sparked the modern study of Beowulf with his lecture, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, which was later published as an essay. The lecture and essay were important for Beowulf scholarship. Many critics at the time were looking at Beowulf solely as a historical document, and they would often discount or ignore the importance of the more fantastical elements of Beowulf, like Grendel or the dragon. Tolkien came along and basically told the literary world that they had missed the forest for the trees. Beowulf can be used as a historical document, but it is, first and foremost, a story. Its monsters and its poetic structure were just as valuable as any historical information gained from it. He also fought against critics of Beowulf for claiming the story either had a very weak theme or no theme at all. Tolkien points out that the theme of human mortality is strong throughout, as well as the theme of time being an undefeated opponent. He also rejected the common classification of Beowulf as an epic, saying, "No terms borrowed from Greek or other literatures exactly fit. There is no reason why they should, though if we must have a term, we should choose rather elegy." I know our stop at Beowulf has not really been about the composition of Beowulf. That's because we don't really know much about it. We don't even know the creator or the transcriber's name. We only know that a story of a conquering hero who faced monsters and dragons and time itself was spoken aloud over 1,000 years ago, and we can still hear it now. For the final leg of our journey, we're going to jump ahead a few hundred more years to the 14th century. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of that old Roman Empire, is being quickly swallowed up by Muslims and will disappear completely by the next century. European nations, including the Holy Roman Empire, had sent waves of troops with the stated intention to help the Byzantines against their Muslim opponents in the previous centuries. They called those incursions crusades. None were really that successful, and most of the time just devolved into the Western nations fighting each other or the Byzantines, while the Muslims claimed more and more land. By 1453, the Ottoman Empire would finish the job and conquer Constantinople, the last real holdout of the Byzantine Empire. Sultans of the Ottoman Empire would claim at various points that they were the true successors of the Roman Empire, having conquered the last remnant of the original empire. Man, when one part of the Roman Empire falls, it always seems like a new empire rises to take its place. To put it another way, the empire long divided must unite. Long united must divide. Thus it has ever been. There's just one issue. Luo Guanzhong didn't write that about the Roman Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, or even the Byzantine Empire. He wrote it about an empire a little further to the east. We went to Greece, we popped by England, and now we finish in China. I mentioned back when we talked about Homer that King Ping of China moved his capital to modern-day Luoyang, becoming the first person to make Luoyang a capital city. He wasn't the last. The Han dynasty used Luoyang as the capital centuries after King Ping, and it played a pivotal role in the events that led to the fall of the dynasty. Luo Guanzhong, despite living about 1,000 years after the fall of the Han, wrote Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which offers an exaggerated version of events about the end of the Han Dynasty and the wars and conflicts that arose in the chaos. And, for the first time this episode, I can pretty confidently say this author wrote the story we're talking about. Now, whether or not he came up with the stories, well, there's some debate. We'll get to that. For now, I'd like to talk a little about what the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is all about, as it's not as popular with English-speaking audiences as it is in the Eastern Hemisphere. Romance of the Three Kingdoms is the story of the final few years of the Han Dynasty and the wars that broke out immediately following it, ending with the final victory of the Jin Dynasty. I call it the final victory of the Jin Dynasty because that's where the book ends. Be aware that the Jin Dynasty almost immediately fell into more rebellions and internal conflicts, though. Now, you can't really call this book a historical account, but you can't truly classify it as fiction. It's heavily based on records of the Three Kingdoms, a contemporary account of the period that at least attempts to be a true historical account. Romance takes a few liberties. It's hard to find a parallel to something in the Western world. Imagine if someone wrote about the American Revolution, but they only used the deified version of the Founding Fathers that modern politicians like to harken back to. So George Washington, instead of being a human being, is the I cannot tell a lie, cherry tree chopping version of himself. It's also somewhat similar to how Shakespeare wrote about history. He would use real history, but then change it around to make it a better narrative. Luo Guanzhong wrote down Romance of the Three Kingdoms at some point in the 14th century. We know he used records of the Three Kingdoms, as well as other historical works for inspiration. However, it's also theorized that a lot of the stories in Romance of the Three Kingdoms may have been existing stories that Luo took from oral storytellers who loved to use people from the Three Kingdoms period as characters for their stories. So while Luo Guanzhong definitely wrote it down and created chunks of it himself, it's possible he also took existing versions of the stories that had been passed down in oral history and put them to paper. Regardless of its origins, Romance of the Three Kingdoms is classified as one of the four masterworks, or one of the classic Chinese novels, which is a group of early Chinese novels that serve as the foundation for Chinese literature. Romance of the Three Kingdoms also serves as the foundation for Dynasty Warriors, an insanely over-the-top action series that takes the already exaggerated history of Romance of the Three Kingdoms and cranks it up to 11. I mentioned Dynasty Warriors when I covered John Milton, so I thought it'd be fitting to end this episode talking about Dynasty Warriors too. So, that's what I got. We covered 3 stories that have no real details about their authors, but are important to the history of storytelling. Homer's work is a significant part of the foundation for all Western literature. Beowulf is one of the first stories to be written in English that still survives today, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms is one of the first Chinese novels and is hugely influential in Eastern literature. So, I wanted to take some time today to talk a little bit about these 3 stories. I know this episode was a little different than what I normally do, but I thought it'd be a fun little diversion. I promise we'll be back to our focus on storytellers over stories next time. Thank you all for listening. I'm sorry for the delay. I got sick, which ruined my first recording of this. Then my actual 9-to-5 job got crazy, which left me very drained at night, but things should be easing up now. Even before all this was designed to be kind of a filler episode. The first 3 authors I covered were planned out. The next series of podcasts I do will also be part of a series, and I just wanted something to kind of sit between them. A palate cleanser, if you will. And this may be something I do in the future as well, using these mini montage episodes for important stories without known storytellers as in between episodes. Is that something you'd want to listen to? Let me know. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions for a storyteller for me to cover, feel free to reach out on Twitter at StoryOfStoryTLR. Or if you've abandoned Twitter, which is completely reasonable, feel free to email me at storyofthestorytellers@gmail.com. Finally, to steal a quote from a pair of goofs, Soupy Twists.